Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. You know why you're here, right? To get smarter, faster.
Yeah.
And today, well, we're going to tackle something pretty big.
Yeah.
The idea that the values we think of as like the core of Western civilization, actually come from Christianity. We're going to be looking at this through the arguments made by Tom Holland.
Yes. Tom Holland, the historian, not.
Not the Spider-Man actor. Yeah.
No.
So our goal here is to like basically figure out what are the big things that Holland is saying about how Christianity shaped the West,
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting arguments that he makes is that even in our increasingly secular age,
Right.
the ethical frameworks and the social assumptions that we have in the West were profoundly shaped by Christian history.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big claim.
It is a big claim. It's like it's so ingrained that we don't even notice it.
Yeah.
He uses that analogy of the goldfish, right?
Yes, the goldfish in the water.
The goldfish doesn't even realize that it's in water.
Exactly.
It's just like everywhere.
And that's kind of like us with Christianity. It's just like everywhere.
Yeah. And what are some of those like specific values that he's talking about?
Well, some of the specific values that he highlights are the inherent dignity of every human being,
Okay.
the principle of equality, the
Like-
belief in progress.
Like the idea that things can get better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this sort of impulse to care for the vulnerable.
Right.
He argues that these things are not sort of universal givens,
Right.
but that they really took shape through the lens of Christianity.
Yeah. And when you look back historically, like early Christianity in the Roman world, that was like a huge shift.
It was revolutionary.
Yeah.
It was completely revolutionary. I mean, the idea that, slaves and the marginalized and the poor had a kind of inherent worth,
Right.
and the idea that God's love was universal, these things were like totally radical.
They were not normal
They were not normal at all.
for the Roman world.
Yeah.
And so that's a really important point, I think.
Yeah. And if you look at the bigger picture, after the Roman Empire fell, the church was vital in preserving classical knowledge and culture.
Right. So like all those books and
All the books, the learning the philosophy,
Yeah.
the sort of seeds of Western civilization were really preserved by the church.
Yeah, so it wasn't just like a break. It was like a continuation
Exactly.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then he talks about some other things too, like how the development of medieval society was shaped by unique Christian ideas.
Yeah, like reformatio,
Reformatio.
which is this Christian concept of continual renewal and improvement.
like always striving to make things better.
Yeah, always striving to make things better, always trying to reform and improve things.
So that's interesting because that kind of goes against the idea that like the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages, right?
Exactly. It
Okay.
was a very dynamic period.
Yeah.
A lot of change,
A lot of change, a lot of progress.
a lot of progress, and also the distinction between religious and secular authority.
Right, so like the separation of church and state.
Yeah, that really starts to develop in the medieval period as well.
Yeah, so that's a big one.
Yeah, and Holland sees this as establishing a pattern for Western history, this sort of constant revolution and reformation.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So, I mean, obviously, there were other cultural influences on the West,
of course.
right? It's not just Christianity, but
Yeah.
his argument is about like pervasiveness, right? Like
Yes.
how far-reaching Christianity's influence was.
Exactly. He argues that Christianity's missionary zeal, combined with the spread of European languages, which themselves are kind of saturated with Christian concepts.
Right, they're built on.
They're built
Yeah.
on. Yeah, they're built on these assumptions.
Right, like
Yeah.
that, human beings are made in the image of God, that there's, good and evil and
Yeah.
these kinds of ideas.
Yeah. And so that gave it a really profound and wide impact.
Yeah, he uses the example of British colonialism in India, where they tried to impose secularism on a society that had very different foundational assumptions.
Right, where secularism didn't really make sense
Right.
in the same way that it did in the West.
Yeah.
Because the West had already been shaped by Christianity
Right.
for so long.
So what about people who like reject Christianity outright?
Yeah, that's what's really interesting.
Are they still influenced by it?
He argues that even people who explicitly reject Christianity are still operating within that moral framework.
So like even if they say they don't believe in it,
Yeah,
they're still kind of thinking like a Christian.
exactly. He points to thinkers like Marx and Dawkins,
No.
who, are very critical of Christianity.
Right.
But their ethical argument even in a secular context, often echo Christian ideals.
Of justice and compassion and things like that.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So does he think that like secular values can survive without Christianity?
That's a big question, and I think he's worried about it.
He's not so sure.
He's not so sure.
Like,
He references Nietzsche's, famous phrase, the death of God,
right.
and the dangers that come with that.
Like when people stop believing.
Yeah, what happens to our values
Right.
when they're no longer grounded in this kind of, religious belief?
Yeah.
He points to things like the world wars,
Oh, wow.
which, happened in societies that were increasingly detached from traditional religious authority.
Right.
And he wonders, can these values endure on their own?
That's a big question, right?
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
And he also talks about things like the rise of, totalitarian regimes in the 20th century.
So in a way, like those are all kind of connected to the loss of that Christian.
He sees them as potentially connected to this sort of decline of Christian belief.
So for the listener at home, like what's the takeaway here?
I think the key takeaway is that even if you're not a Christian,
Right.
you can't really understand Western civilization without understanding Christianity.
Because it's so ingrained in everything.
It's part of the water that we swim in.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And even if you don't agree with all of Holland's arguments, I think it's really important to grapple with this idea.
Yeah, like it's something to think about.
Yeah, and to think about how these values might fare
Right.
in a world that's becoming increasingly secular.
Yeah, and that's the question that he leaves us with, right?
Yeah, can these values survive?
When they survive without their original religious foundation.
Yeah,
That's food for thought.
it is.
It's a big question.
A huge question.
Something to ponder, after this deep dive is over.
Yeah, it's definitely something that stays with you.
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's important to look at other perspectives too.
Right. Like not just Holland.
Not just Holland's, right? There are other historians and philosophers who had different takes on this.
Right.
And I think it's important to kind of, get a broader view
Yeah.
of this whole question.
So that's something that maybe we can explore in a future deep dive.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Tom Holland's ideas about the influence of Christianity on the West. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we hope you'll join us again next time for another thought-provoking deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
See you later.
Bye.